Hi and welcome to Boston Media Theory. I'm Marcus Breen, and we're here to talk about various aspects of media and communication theory as it is practiced by and undertaken by people who live and work in Boston. All sorts of people: academics, researchers, activists, creative artists. And today, the second part of an interview with our guest, Tarleton Gillespie, from Microsoft Research here in Boston. And Tarleton is a member of the Social Media Collective, which we can hear about later,
Great.
and formerly of the Department of Information Science and Communication at Cornell University. So welcome, Tarleton.
Thank you.
Welcome back.
Sure.
And this time, well, the previous time we talked about some of the complexities of communication environment in the new media world and some references to intellectual property and copyright, and the challenges for academics and the role of academics and critics in making a contribution, as well as some references to algorithms. This time I wanted to ask you a little bit about what it means to be a critical worker, a critical thinker in this field, and how we might think about taking a critical approach to the internet.
Yeah.
I know the internet is a very large thing, object, but think about how and discuss how that plays out. And this is against the background of all sorts of controversies about whether or not there's human agency or human activity determining our interactions with each other through social media and through the internet generally, and whether or not we've lost control over it, you and I as users, the public generally, even down to concepts of whether or not the idea of the public has been redefined. So some of their big themes, I know, but I wanted to try and get to some of those in this discussion. And I'm wondering firstly if you could tell us a little bit about one resource that you've developed as a way of encouraging public discussion and of making available to people ideas around digital activity, and that is this site called Culture Digitally, of which you're the co-founder.
Right. Yeah. I'm pretty proud of Culture Digitally. It was sort of an accident or a surprise. So I co-founded it with Hector Postigo, who's at Temple University. And our original idea was to have two conferences of an invited group of scholars to have a workshop. That was it. And we got some funding from the National Science Foundation, which was incredibly generous. And one idea we had was for the year between the two events, why don't we have a sort of co-authored blog just between the 20 or so people that were going to come to both events, just as a place for people to write to each other, but publicly, on some of the scholarship on new media that they were thinking about. So we did that, and we had our second event, and then we said, well, the blog's been interesting, let's sort of keep it going. And to the credit of Hector, to the credit of some of the original contributors, it kept going. I think part of what happened was there were some people in our group who were interested in having a place that they could respond much more quickly to interesting concerns than they could through the kind of traditional academic publication, which can take a real long time. There are some journals that are trying to think about how to do things more quickly, how to do them open access, but by and large that process is still surprisingly slow. And when you're doing scholarship about new media, you're dealing with, the technology's changing, the fascination changing, the political dynamics changing, such that you write something and then it comes out almost 2 years later, and it feels quaint because you haven't had a chance to sort of update the ideas. We really thought of it as a place where anyone could write anything, recommend an article, small scale. But what happened was people wrote long-ish pieces, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10 paragraphs that were not an academic article in the fullest sense, but really had a thoughtful take on an issue, much more than a, hey, look at what's in the news kind of gesture. And for whatever reason, the fact that we did some of those, there were people who we knew in the field that we kind of invited, said, if you ever want to write something, people came to us. I think it spoke to kind of an underserved need for academics who wanted to do thoughtful, scholarly work, but also wanted that work to engage with conversations that were happening publicly at the time they were happening, instead of reflecting on them 2 years later and only talking to academics. You can see now other versions of it, so you can almost imagine that this was a very clumsy version of a single group inside of Medium, right? So Medium lets people sort of blog without having to run blogs, and you can set up a group that like several authors write for a single column. In a weird way, we did that. We just did one of them. But for better or for worse, and we've ended up having more meetings. So we've had gatherings at conferences where we meet up with scholars that we interact with. We've done a special issue of a journal where we sort of found authors that could develop some of that work into full-fledged academic publications. And so it's been we've had a very kind of loose hand on sort of what people bring to what they want out of that. And it's been great so far.
So what about this connection between culture and digital activities?
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Well, I mean, we named it very broadly because what we wanted to do in the first place, the very idea of the first events, was that the people we thought were doing interesting work on the real implications of digital culture, participatory culture, the rise of platforms. In my mind, it's like all of the work that says, we had this enthusiasm about the web and about everything the internet can do, and now we're in this kind of long hangover of what are the realities of how that's now structured? How do we think about the world that has now generated? That work was happening in sociology departments, in communication departments, in media studies departments, information science departments, anthropology departments. And the people we liked, they didn't all live in the same discipline, they didn't all live at the same conference, and they weren't all publishing in the same journal. So in order to make a space for that, instead of saying this is a sociology practice or this is a communication activity, we invited the people we thought were fascinating. And we named it to try to give kind of the largest umbrella to say that work that you're doing that we think is adding something to the conversation, that belongs under the umbrella culture digitally. It was meant to be very broad and all-encompassing.
Of course, the question, let me pursue that a little bit more though, the question of culture, of course, is a question of, as Raymond Williams suggested, both about artifacts, things that are made by human beings to represent them and to direct how they should live. Sometimes they end up in museum cases behind glass, but in a more digital environment, they're really the tools that we're using on a day-to-day basis. But Williams also talked about the way that culture is just ordinary, the things that we do in an ordinary way, the way we live, without being too excited about it. And it's also those things that we care deeply about at a rather, if you like, social register, like the opera or the cinema or, I don't know, a live music performance or the way we decorate our homes. So there's a whole bunch of kind of questions around culture now that it is this ephemeral form of information flows and that becomes knowledge. So that's what I'm seeking to investigate a little bit.
Yeah, I thought the word culture being in there was incredibly important, and it was informed by some of the ideas that Williams is addressing. I think in some ways, if we'd flipped the words around and said digital culture, there are certain things now that fall into that category. It's memes, right? It's one of the most ephemeral and seemingly disposable, although I think people are making very compelling arguments that it is much more substantive than it might pretend to be. By flipping the word around, it's like, what are all the ways in which culture, in all of those meanings, encounters the digital? So then you can have someone writing about memes and cat videos, and you can have someone writing about harassment in the darkest corners of Reddit, and you can have someone writing about journalism on the most pressing issues, and you can have someone writing about activism in far corners of the world. And what unites them is what Williams points to, is sort of like the way that human practices involve the production of symbols and the circulation of those symbols to connect people. I think we are getting in this interesting place where Williams's definitions helped explain this one-time distinction between the kind of high culture, the museum, the things we celebrate and the things we preserve, and then the day-to-day. We've got this funny meeting point where we have the things that are most day-to-day are also still there, right? They're still preserved, at least in some degree, and can be encountered, right? So the tweet you say offhand or the funny image that you pass on, but then it's sitting there and it becomes part of something, part of a community or part of a collaboration, or it gets picked up by someone else. So some of the ways in which things that we deliberately put out in the world, like a newspaper article or museum exhibit, in order to be taken up, now even the things that we do casually as part of our ordinary life also can be taken up.
Sure.
So I kind of like the point that we can discuss both of the ideas of culture that Williams is pointing to, and in the ways that they encounter each other differently than they ever did before.
Yeah, it brings to mind the fact that so many of the things that are banal, which we may do online, become not only captured and are archived, as it were,
Yes.
and become part of a conversation that we might not previously have really thought possible.
Right. And what's funny, though, is that my interest in media and popular culture and the circulation of music and entertainment made me want to focus on that. But as we were setting this up, there was also, I think, a real turn in the literature and in the conversation to say, to understand new media, we have to pay attention to the infrastructure beneath it, material and institutional. We have to pay attention to the labor that's going on, not just through these systems, but behind these systems. So in some ways, I think we spent less time on culture in the classic sense than I thought we would. But maybe that instinct that the group had was right, which is to say, if you're going to want to understand memes or Twitter revolutions or how people create their profiles, you also have to think about how databases are organized, and you have to think about who is deleting your videos somewhere, another part of the world, and that's part of it too. That's if we think about cultural production and both the institutional, commercial, and practiced levels of cultural production, we need a glimpse of all three of those, because they're all changing together.
Sure, they are, and yet the word convergence also comes to mind as something that puts them all in the one space.
Right, that's right.
Yeah. Not an easy thing to have to deal with. Culture digitally also seems to me to offer, again, as I suggested earlier, a public place, and that's, in my way of thinking, a valuable contribution that academics can make. That there's a lot of pressure on universities, as you know, to change and to be more connected, maybe with not only to produce students that are work ready, as they say, but also to produce students who can make significant contributions, which is moved from the luxury of what might have been a couple of generations ago, where universities was something you could do and then you'd continue in the professions. Right. So there's some significant changes, and the cost of education is very high. But what a site like Culture Digitally does is to say, we're going to have a conversation with anybody who wants to read this stuff and inform you and bring you into this otherwise, I don't know, what is it, elite, exclusive space of the university, of the scholar.
Yeah, I hope that's true. As I said, it was originally imagined as just a way to let scholars be together. But the weird instinct that now seems counterintuitive, which says let's do it all publicly, did have some of that spirit in it. Yeah. I think for me, and I don't know if I can speak for, I think we have drawn scholars who have this instinct, but this is my take on it, is that I came to scholarship wanting it to be a smart way to involve myself in conversations that not just scholars have.
Yeah.
To me, as a grad student, I was fascinated with what was being talked about in Wired magazine. Yeah. And that wasn't scholarship, but it was often very interesting and sharp takes, constrained by what it needed to be, but so is scholarship, right? So, so how do you do work? How do you be thoughtful in a way that someone who is an intelligent pursuer of these topics from whatever area, an interested citizen, a policymaker, someone inside a tech company, or an academic, and wants to figure out these problems, comes to it with their own frameworks and their own kind of time constraints, but nevertheless wants to engage in a conversation. How do you do that, and how do you create scholarship that is accessible to that conversation without losing what it offers, a sophistication? I think in some ways, the exercise of writing on a public blog, it doesn't have to be Culture Digitally, it could be for a medium, it could be on your own blog. One of the things it challenges you to do is to say, how do I talk about this issue in a way that isn't the way I'd talk to my 5 closest scholarly colleagues who understand all the base assumptions and already have all the reference points. And throwing out scholarly references isn't going to work, but I also don't want to make it superficial. I don't want to thin it out. So there is a way to do both. It's not easy. No. But writing long form online and publicly read material at least exercises that muscle a little bit.
Sure, and it seems to be something that's much more likely to happen because of digital technology.
I think that's right.
Anybody who has a device can pretty well read anything.
That's right.
We don't have a special password or anything.
That's exactly right.
Which is great, and we should welcome. At least I should say for myself, we should welcome this circulation of knowledge, which was always part of this idea about what the internet might produce.
Right. I can imagine it's something that for junior scholars, it's still a concern about what does that time look like on a tenure application? What is that? You know, because I have the advantage of having already had tenure, and I don't have to worry about that anymore. But there is still some hesitation about that's not a publication. How, you know, so I think we're changing. I think there are lots of departments, especially that deal with new media in some way, that recognize this interest and engagement. But there's still some inertia there as well.
Yeah, although I must say that there are and there should be many questions that are raised about tenure.
That's right. This is just one of them.
This is just one of them. That's right.
Yes.
I think it's while it's a wonderful thing to have a job for life once you're tenured, it's another thing to recognise that the incredible amount of constraints that are placed on scholars who should be making other contributions in a troubled world are rushing off to do things that are only going to count on a piece of paper when someone checks them off on a list.
That's right. That's right.
There's something wrong with that in terms of the larger contributions that intellectual work should be making to society, which brings to mind what you're doing in the Microsoft research environment, which seems to me to partly bridge that part of that problem.
Yeah. I had a great decade, a little bit more at Cornell. I'm still affiliated as a faculty with the communication department and the information science department. But I've joined Microsoft Research, been there for 2 years now. And that was a move. So Microsoft Research is, in my mind, a unique institution because it is a industry research group, but it is very academically minded, more so than I think most of the parallel ones that I see. So for the most part, I feel like an academic that's being hosted, which is a real treat. That's not exactly a perfect characterization of it, but I think it's one example of places where these kind of questions are finding different places to live. There's traditional academic departments that are smart enough to host these questions. There are interdisciplinary departments, there are centers, there are industry sponsored, there are independent, and I think all of these innovations for figuring out, I like that these questions are happening in different places. They each have to then struggle with the constraints of their own institution, but it begins to get at that concern we were talking about earlier about how you ask questions that understand this complexity of the technological environment we live in and can ask pointed and historically grounded and thoughtful sociological questions about that at the same time.
Sure, and when I started I said we're also going to deploy some trajectories, if you like, around critical questions. And I suppose one of the critical questions is not only to do with making contribution to public discussion or discourse as it's also known, but also to, if you like, engage in public policy making. And you've done a lot of work and useful contributions around that field, and I would suggest that the Social Media Collective maybe can make a contribution there. How do you see your role as a researcher and as a theorist contributing to public policy making? Because it's a huge field, I know, but there's let me maybe just elaborate a little bit in the sense in which so much of our lives are privatised. So much of our lives operate as if not only government in this country especially is bad, in the United States is bad and a problem, but that if we just have private whatever solutions, it's all good. And somehow or other, the public interest and the public is left hanging. And this seems to me to be the real challenge and the real contribution that you've made.
Yeah. It's incredibly hard, and I think what I've been trying to do, is to attend to the kind of current cultural formations, attend to what's happening in the way people use social media and the way news circulates, but do it in a way that tries to bring to it vocabulary. And that vocabulary is both meant to kind of say, okay, what is this an example of? What's the nature of the problem? And also connect it to longer term questions. So to me, it's all too easy for something that's happening right now in the fizz of digital culture to seem like we've never encountered this question before. And there's nothing to me more debilitating than that presumption, because then it means all the things we've had to ask and not resolve about how we got news in a traditional television environment or a traditional publishing environment, how those very same questions are being grappled with, right? How we cope with a world of information we don't get to produce ourselves that is then arriving at our door through the hands of commercially interested stakeholders.
Yeah,
Right? That's,
yeah.
If you phrase it that way, it's not a new question at all. Who the stakeholders are, how it is that they gather information, and how they describe the process in ways that legitimate it as the right one are different, and those have to be interrogated. I think scholars have a way to do that because they can train their attention to the contemporary problem, gather empirical evidence, say smart analytical things about what's going on, but then line it up with a thread to how have we encountered this question before? What exactly needs to be reimagined about the way we ask the question before, and what doesn't?
Yeah.
That to me isn't, it lives between kind of like theoretical construction and just sort of like policy advice. I grant that it lives in the middle, and I think there are people I respect who do either of those things that I just don't happen to do. But I do think there is work for people who want to think, I can see the contours of what's forming now, and I can see it as emerging solutions to questions we have actually asked for a long time.
Yeah, sure.
And if one emerging solution settles in as the solution, then that's how we've addressed this ongoing concern about how there's equity in information, how private stakeholders are held to public obligation. If we don't ask that question, then yes, the sort of private logic wins.
Yes.
So part of it is providing language. Maybe policymakers could take that language up, or maybe it's language that if you can inject it into their conversation, then just the next time a decision is made, someone just doesn't rest on the explanation they have. They sort of bring that parameter back.
Sure.
Like, is this public interest? What does that mean?
Yeah, right.
If you can just ask that question every time, then it at least opens up the possibility that we ask a question other than, were consumers satisfied by this service?
Sure, and that can be a critical question.
Yeah.
In the sense in which it will trouble some people who, as Thorsten Veblen said, have a vested interest in making sure that those people who might be excluded are included.
Exactly.
And it raises some interesting challenges to do with what we mean by the institutions of regulation.
Right.
The Federal Communication Commission in this country, but every nation has a regulatory agency, all of whom seem to me to be challenged by these kinds of questions, don't they?
That's right.
How do you see that kind of playing out? The internationalisation of these challenges.
Yeah, well, I think it's the internationalization is a big part of it, and I think it also is the separation out of consumer services from infrastructure services. So people, at least in the US, get very antsy when you start talking about should social media be regulated.
Yes, they do indeed.
Of course they are, right? They are in all sorts of ways that don't look like regulation or seem to cover a thing that's so patently acceptable that we don't worry about it.
So what would be, just to help our viewers, what would be an example, a couple of examples of how social media is regulated? What regulates it?
Well, I mean, so one example, and it's an easy example because it's extreme, is that there are laws against child pornography. Every social media platform is obligated, and I'm not saying they shouldn't be, and most of the platforms are extremely happy to do this, but they're under legal obligation to report anytime they encounter something that they think is child pornography. Perfectly reasonable to do so. But it pushes on the lie that says these are unregulated services.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? That's a regulation that seems completely reasonable. I think it's being done very well. I have no question with it. But the next question, which is, okay, what do you do with terrorist content? Okay, that's not so easy.
Yeah.
That's not so consensus.
No.
When a social network says, you don't get to regulate us, well, they do. And if they say, we should regulate this topic, there are reasons to say no. So that is where a discussion has to happen.
Absolutely.
And it's one that's fueled and sparked by the intensity of the conversation about terrorism, about danger. It raises very difficult questions about the fact that these are international platforms in the sense of who they serve and where information goes.
Yeah.
But it doesn't put to bed the question of, is this a thing that the platforms can decide on their own to handle? Is this something they should be nudged to do through regulation or competition, or is it something that there needs to be an apparatus that says, this is how we handle this category?
Yeah. Yes.
Either of those comes with very tricky questions about how you define the category and what the implications are and who gets a pass on that rule and who enforces it.
Right, and recognising that we are always in this, if you like, this historical moment of communication history.
Right.
we're always in history, and we do have resources to draw on.
Yes.
In terms of how we think of ourselves as citizens, or how we think of others as needing care or needing compassion.
That's right.
It's not always an easy conversation to have.
Absolutely.
There are deeply embedded political and other interests at play that don't always seek to support whatever you want to call it.
That's right.
Critical thinking, regulation, public policy.
Yeah, and I think in some ways right now the hardest thing about that is that when you start to imagine that those are tricky, in some way unresolvable questions that require messy political negotiations, that's hard. What sounds easier is a technological solution that will resolve the problem,
Right. Yes.
which I think is a politically debilitating viewpoint, but a very appealing one, a very seductive one. And so when platforms say we can resolve this problem, and that takes away the moment where you say, what are you defining it as? What do you do with the edge cases? Who gets to oversee this process? Questions that we've asked before, messy, political, social questions. The issue is not, are they making the wrong decision? The issue is, you've put away the messy but important discussion because it's messy and important.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the thing we're struggling with now.
Yes, and the people who say those kinds of things, and I'm thinking of the owners of maybe the PayPal folk, or the we'll leave their names out of it, but the PayPal folk, or the Facebook folk, or people, Google folk. I mean, very, very wealthy, influential people.
Sure.
In some cases, they really do tend to say, "Just don't worry about it. We'll do it all." It's that kind of libertarian approach, and that sort of politics is certainly tricky and disturbing.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very important historical exercise for the contemporary period to unpack the way that kind of technological, solutions and libertarian principles have lined up. I think in reality, these companies struggle internally with really the decisions are messy, and a lot of times we're hearing a gloss as a public about this can be resolved with clean, shiny technology.
Oh, that's interesting.
I think in practice they know how messy this is, and every so often we get a glimpse of it, and then it gets sort of put aside. So I don't know whether to pin it on there's a Silicon Valley take that sort of wants to handle this all, or whether that's a promise that then underneath is there are messy decisions being made. But I think they are messy decisions made inside of a framework that says these are information problems that should have information technology solutions, and that's only sometimes the case.
Yes, and in fact, it seems to me that you're in a position as a researcher, in your case, but for all of us, where there's a challenge to say, well, going back to the culture digitally, how do we bring the vast bulk of the public and as users into this conversation, because they're so obsessed, as some critics might say, of just looking at whatever's the latest feed or the latest bit of information. The possibilities of there being a real challenge with them not even being aware of what's being undertaken on their behalf.
Right. I think that's the hope, is that there's a scholarly conversation that can pull the hood open a little bit and say, we're dealing with a messy, complicated problem. Here are its parameters, and now what?
Right. Well, now what indeed. Well, Tarleton, thank you very much. And that's it from us. Thank you, and that's it from me, from Marcus Breen and Boston Media Theory. Until next time, thanks, and see you later.
Did you know kids who play outdoors have healthier lungs?
Totally.
Did you know that boys that play with dolls make better husbands?
My son has lots of dolls.
But did you know terry cloth diapers breathe better?
I did.
It's totally true.
Oh, yeah.
Did you guys know statistically friendly kids have more friends?
Yeah.
That's obvious.
Did you know most people think they're using the right car seat for their kid, but they're not?
Parents who really know it all know for sure that their child is in the right seat. Visit safercar.gov/the-right seat to make sure your child is protected.